Tuesday, cold November evening with a packed house, standing room only for lack of a better term, a planning event. I think it speaks to how awesome this town is, how engaged our citizens are, and how passionate we are about this city. Yeah. So my name is Kyle Sloat. I'm an associate here in town at TCA Theron Curran Architects. I'm the chair of Young Architects Hamilton. They got their cue. They're in the back. And I'm a member of the Hamilton-Burlington Society of Architects. Today I'm here on behalf of the HBSA to welcome and thank all of you for coming out tonight to what is surely to be a lively and engaging evening. Normally, our HBSA chair, Graham McNally, would be up here doing all these introductions. But tonight, he's in Toronto. He's actually schmoozing on behalf of all of us at Queen's Park. I wasn't aware of this, but apparently today is Hamilton Day at Queen's Park, and there's a big reception there, and I'm sure at this very moment he's bending the ear of the Premier or somebody else in our favor, so it's a good thing. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to the good folks here at Mills Hardware for donating this beautiful, well-designed, award-winning space for tonight's event. I've been asked to note the location of the bar. It's the bar-shaped element over there. It is a cash bar tonight, so please enjoy. We'd also like to thank Joey Coleman of the Public Record. Joey will be recording the event, and I believe it'll be online at some point so we can extend the reach of everything that's discussed here tonight. So tonight we'll be hearing from Dr. Pamela Blais. Dr. Blais is an urban planner and principal at Metropole Consultants Limited. Her focus is on creating better cities by integrating planning, economic, and environmental thinking in the analysis of urban issues and the development of innovative policy. In her 20-plus year career as an urban planning consultant, her work has included re-urbanization strategies, long-term regional growth planning, municipal economic development strategies, innovative land use policies for industrial areas, very relevant to Hamilton, urban regeneration strategies, sustainable urban form, community design and infrastructure, and research on the impact of technology on urban form. She's the author of Perverse Cities, Hidden Subsidies, Wonky Policy, and Urban Sprawl, which was shortlisted for the 2011 Donner Book Prize, awarded to the Best Canadian Public Policy Book of the Year. Pamela has a master's in planning from the University of Toronto and a PhD in urban economic geography from the London School of Economics, and we are very grateful that she is here tonight. And tonight, Pamela will be looking more specifically at the Hamilton context. We have some other panelists as well with local knowledge, and I know Dr. Blais has been doing some research on what's been happening here in town, discussing whether the existing models of city building are working to help build the best city possible. Does the development framework make sense for what we now know and understand about city building? Does this framework align with our vision of Hamilton? So why are we, as the Hamilton-Burlington Society of Architects, co-hosting this event? For one, the development framework of planning documents such as the official plan, neighborhood plans, zoning, permits, grants, incentives, etc., dictate what we as architects can design for our clients. They're the DNA from which the city grows. The kind of city we want must be built into this system, and from this system, our buildings will grow. Tonight, we'll question whether we are getting the Hamilton we want from our existing development framework. As a hint to my opinion on that, I'll tell you that my colleagues and I have to seek variances on just about every single project we do here in town, adding considerable expense to every single project for our clients, and that's money that can't be spent on design on the project itself. Just tonight, I was speaking to a good friend and heard that we're running into variance issues and setback issues on a local park that's being redeveloped. So we also wanted to highlight the importance of this discussion in the context of the LRT corridor. Again, this is a massive opportunity for Hamilton, as we all know, but will this current development framework allow it to reach its potential and will it match the vision that we have for our city? Lastly, we as a profession just care a heck of a lot about the city that we practice in. So we hope that this is not only an engaging and informative evening for all of you, but that everyone here will come away with actionable ideas and tools that will be more than a one-liner for you to use at the next cocktail party you're at, but rather that we can use to lobby, nudge, maybe even agitate a little bit so that our development framework will shift to become more closely aligned with our collective vision for Hamilton. So tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Useful Knowledge Society of Hamilton. I'm now going to call on one of their founding members, Ryan McGreal, who will serve as our moderator for the evening. As I'm sure many of you guys know, Ryan is the editor of Raise the Hammer, and he is active in many, 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 many initiatives, all of which share the common thread of making Hamilton a more vibrant, livable community. So please welcome to the stage, Ryan.
Thank you all so much. I will keep this short and sweet because you're here to listen to Dr. Blais and not me, but I just wanted to say, I have to say that the mood in here tonight feels quite a lot different than it did back in March when we had Ken Sealing in to talk about what Waterloo Region was doing to prepare for LRT. Essentially, they were doing everything right and we were all depressed because we were doing everything wrong. Despite our best efforts, we're getting LRT anyway, and so the discussion we're having now is how can we make sure we get the most out of it? How can we make sure that we maximize this once-in-a-generation opportunity? So we'll start with a 30-minute or so presentation, and then after that we'll take a 15-minute break, at which time we encourage you to go and visit the bar-shaped object over in the corner. After that, we're going to have a discussion, I guess a moderated discussion, but rather than a really kind of formal, strict Q&A, we're hoping for it to be more of a community discussion. And we have a few local subject matter experts in the audience who I'm hoping we can call upon, and I'll go a bit more into that afterwards. But for now, without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Pamela Blais.
Like the crusty old school teacher up here at the desk. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's fine for me. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, it's okay? No? Yes, no? And now, can everyone hear me? Yeah? Yes? Okay. Anyway, thank you so much. It's really great to be here. As I'm not going to spend a lot of time giving an introduction. I think the topic has already been really well addressed. It's so exciting, I think, at this particular moment where this could be a pivotal moment in Hamilton with the LRT coming. What I'm going to do is really give a kind of outsider's view. Obviously, you are the people that are the experts on Hamilton, not me. I've been, doing the wonkish thing and looking at some of the data, and just a fair warning that we're going to head fairly deep into wonk territory in this talk. I think the question I was given to address is, we have this LRT coming. Are we doing the right things in order to capitalize upon that opportunity? And what has to happen in order to really make the most of that opportunity that is being presented? And so what I'm going to do is really focus on the development pattern. So how is the city growing, and is it growing in a way that would actually take as much advantage of the LRT opportunity as possible? And what would have to change or shift in order to really capitalize on the opportunity that's being presented. So I'm going to start off just by talking a little bit about what is happening now in terms of current development patterns. And again, I'm sure this is nothing that you don't already know. But we look, for example, the province has intensification targets. Now we have to have a certain percentage of residential growth now in the already urban area according to the plan for the whole region, which the target is 40%. Hamilton is slightly below that, doing a bit better than some of the other places, at least in 2010. The update to this that I've seen is that now Hamilton is at about 30% in the 4-year period since 2010. So not quite meeting the targets in terms of the number of units on already urbanized land, but actually, doing better than some of the other places, other regions in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. There's certainly, I'm sure, again, I don't have to tell you, development happening in the already urbanized area. So the gray area that's shown there is the area that was urbanized as of 2001. And the little purple dots each represent 100 housing units. So we're missing some of the dots that are smaller numbers. So tens of units wouldn't show up there. But obviously it does show that there's some significant new residential development happening in the already urban area. And of course, when we look at population though, the population picture is quite a bit different. So there's population decline happening. So the red dots are areas of population loss, and the blue dots are areas of population growth. So there is quite a bit of population loss within the urban area during that 10-year period as well. So looking at the hard numbers here, within the already urban area, there's been, I would say, about 7,000 residential units that were added between 2001 and 2011. And there was still a population loss during that same period. It looks like of about 6,000 or 7,000 people in the already urbanized area during that period. At the same time, during the same period, there were another over 10,000 units added to the greenfield area of the city. And as you can see, there was a net population gain in that area of about, well, these numbers are pretty small on my screen, but it looks like about over 30,000, 35,000 in that area. We see the same kind of patterns on the employment side. We don't have as good data on the employment, but each of these red dots represents a loss of 100 jobs, and each blue dot represents a gain of 100 jobs. So you can see, again, in the already urbanized area, particularly, this is just core employment, so this isn't things like local schools or shopping. There's no retail included here. It's manufacturing, business services, those kinds of activities. So there's been widespread manufacturing loss across the region, which is one of the reasons why there's a lot of red dots there. But even in terms of the local services employment, there's been some loss in some areas, again, in the inner area of Hamilton, but some gain as well. So it's not quite as overall red as it is for the core employment. So I guess the point here is that Hamilton really seems to face a double challenge. So there is loss happening in the inner area. So before we can even get to the point of kind of getting back to the black, there's a lot of development that has to be added just to regain existing losses in terms of population employment to get back to even to 2001 levels of population and employment. So it's a double challenge. So luckily, at the same time, there's also a major opportunity with the LRT announcement. And this really has the ability to catalyze a lot of city building activity in the city. It can attract development to the LRT corridor. We can get more density in the LRT corridor. More density means the ability to support economically more services, more shops, more kinds of services for the population, different amenities, improved accessibility, so it's easier to get to the places that you need to get to, economic development in terms of attracting in outside investment in terms of offices and also residential development, and the opportunity to really reshape the development patterns into something that's more efficient with less costly infrastructure. So on that less costly infrastructure, I guess one of the points that's really important is that there are cost savings to be had from efficient urban form. And this is actually for the Halifax urban region, which is of a similar size to Hamilton. They did a recent study that showed how much it costs the city to provide the services for a suburban house, a typical suburban house, compared to cost for services for a typical urban house. And as you can see, the numbers are very, very different. This is on a per unit basis. Also, on the revenue side, denser development also is really a revenue star. And this, I'm sorry the quality of this, I just took it off the computer screen, but this is some work that was done for the city of Guelph by a guy from the States called Joe Minikazi. And he does a very simple thing, which is he figures out what is the property tax revenue for different kinds of development, and then he puts it on a per hectare basis. And when you do that, you kind of see the revenue efficiency of different kinds of development. So these kind of mid-rise buildings that you see here are actually real revenue stars, particularly when you compare them. So they would be at the right end of this scale. So this is property tax revenue per hectare for different kinds of development. And I'm sorry, you probably can't see, but along the left, all the sort of low-lying bars are things like Target stores and Tim Hortons distribution centers, shopping malls, things like that. And as you get to small kind of innocuous-looking buildings that happen to be 3 or 4 stories high, the actual property tax per hectare goes up substantially. So higher revenues, lower costs, it's a pretty winning combination for the city. So capitalizing on this investment really requires, as we've seen, the development patterns will require a major shift in the current development pattern. So if you want that shift to happen, it's not going to happen on its own. There's really a few key things that are shaping development patterns, which by that I mean what kind of development gets built and where. So it's really about the market, and that is the supply side, what builders and developers bring to market, as well as the demand side, what consumers and home buyers and businesses want, and of course that's mediated through price. There's infrastructure investments, what kind of investment is taking place in infrastructure and where, and there's planning policy, official plans, the kinds of things that have been talked about already. But we really need an integrated approach that addresses all 3 of these areas and make sure that they are all aligned in order to bring about this fundamental shift in development pattern. So we have the urban form and the transportation working together, presumably, and then that is really kind of supported by this kind of 3-sided donut, if you want to put it that way, which is about the planning framework, the spending or investment, and pricing. And it's really these 3 pieces that have to work together. So I think the planning is underway, and that's kind of a more known quantity in terms of the 3 elements that have to work together. I'm going to talk a bit more about the things that don't get talked about so much, and that is about the spending and the pricing. So first of all, talking about shift and how that relates to an integrated approach to spending. So this is about investment in infrastructure, where, what kinds of infrastructure, and creating frameworks that make sure that you get the maximum public and city building benefits out of those investments. And I'm going to just look at this fairly quickly. So this is, what I'm going to look at is the development charge spending. So when a development charge bylaw is put into place, the city prepares a background study and they figure out how much growth there's going to be, and then they say, okay, we're going to have to spend X dollars on infrastructure to support that new growth. And that's what these charts are about. So it's not the full capital budget of the city, it's just the growth-related capital costs. So what it shows is that there's a plan to spend a little bit less than $1.7 billion over the next 5 years in order to support the new development that's coming to the city. And you can see what that consists of in terms of what kinds of infrastructure that money is being spent on. The biggest share is that blue slice, which is almost half, which is water and wastewater infrastructure. And then the rest, roads and transit, in other words, transportation, make up another big chunk. So those 2 things together are almost 3/4 of the spending, and those are linear types of infrastructure. And so the cost of those really is affected by density. And I'm going to come back to that. And a really important part of this is about, again, aligning the spending and focusing very strategically on the infrastructure investment. And a key part of that is how much is being spent on roads and how much is being spent on transit. So this idea of shift really means attracting riders out of cars and getting them onto the LRT. And in order to do that, we really have to make sure that the ability to do that isn't really being undermined by a lot of spending on car infrastructure. So if you're contemplating a shift to a new way of travel in the region and in the city, and you keep spending the same way we have been in the past on auto infrastructure, it's not really going to, support that shift from one mode of transportation to transit. So there is planned now about $300,000. That's what's in the growth-related expenditures over the next 5 years, which is on road infrastructure, and just over $100 million on transit. And of course, that doesn't include the money that's going to be spent by the province, lucky for you, on the LRT. So it's not to say that we don't need roads. We need roads, but it really there has to be a lot of really rigorous analysis of the kind of spending, and does that spending on roads actually support this shift? A lot of it is related to capacity expansions. There's also included in that, I noticed, $46 million for 2 parking structures, one of which is in downtown. So it seems to me that, I don't know the details of this, but it jumped out at me that if you're contemplating an LRT downtown, you probably wouldn't want to be building a parking structure downtown. Anyway, there's a lot of interesting things in the development charges background study, if you ever have the time or inclination to look at. Okay, so that's just a kind of an example in terms of the spending side. On the prices side, what do I mean by prices? Well, prices really are key drivers of development patterns. They shape decisions of all kinds. I think we all know that when we go to buy something, we're not immune to what the price tells us about it. They really drive decision-making on both the supply side and the demand side. And what I really mean here is what I'm calling public sector prices. So in the public sector, we set what are, in essence, prices for things like development charges, property taxes, user fees of different kinds. So this is a public lever that we have in order to shape development patterns, and we're not really making use of this at all. In fact, the cards in terms of the public sector prices are currently really stacked against development that would support the LRT in Hamilton, as in most municipalities really across Ontario. The status quo that we have now is really a market that's distorted by public policies and hidden subsidies. So I'm going to explain, I'm going to give you some examples of this, about 4 of my key sort of distortions and elements of mispricing that I found, and I'm going to just use the development charge as an example. There are other examples in other areas, but I'll use the development charge as an example, in part because it's something that's actually quite easily changed, and if you change the development charge, that would have a pretty immediate impact in terms of what gets built where. So Economics 101, which I did really badly at, but I did learn that the prices should reflect the cost for the efficient allocation of resources. So this is the basic principle to make sure that we're not overspending or underspending on something. When we apply this to the urban context, it means that those public sector prices that I've been talking about should reflect the actual costs. And those costs in an urban context for servicing, for infrastructure, for roads, water pipes, and so on, relate to density, they relate to the location of development, and they relate to the type of land use. So going back to that $1.7 billion of growth-related capital cost, there's a principle that growth pays for growth, and that was really one of the underlying principles of the whole development charge system. So we take that $1.7 billion, and what happens is it gets allocated to different places. So some of that money comes from federal and provincial governments, about 10% of that. Some of that money is taken off the development charge because the legislation doesn't allow municipalities to charge for all of it. So things like level of service, ineligible. I hope you can read that. And then there's this other thing that you see on your left called the benefit to existing. So this is a very interesting thing also buried in development charge background studies, and that is that a certain part of the cost is, even though it's growth-related costs for growth-related infrastructure, it's deemed to benefit existing development. So those costs are taken off the development charge as well. In this case, it's $552 million of that total bill, and that's put on the property tax. So if we look at that just as a pie, what you find is that of the growth-related costs that have been identified for Hamilton for the next 5 years, a little bit less than half of that would be covered by the development charges themselves. And all the areas that are blue, which is about 570, this is very small here, but I think it's around $570 million, mostly benefit to existing development, that goes onto the property tax. And then the other things are picked up elsewhere. So this is something that I'm always confused about, is this benefit to existing development. They're growth-related costs, but they're deemed to benefit existing residents and existing businesses. It's a bit like, I call it the garden effect. So if I have, on my property, I build a beautiful garden, I spend 10 grand, and my neighbor benefits because now he gets to look out his window and see my beautiful garden, and that makes him very happy. But then I go to him and I knock on his door and I say, well, you're benefiting, so here's a bill for $2,000. Will you please pay this to me? And it's a bit like this, I think, with the development charges. I think it might be okay, and there is a rationale to say, yes, existing residents and businesses may benefit from having, better bridges or new recreation facilities, but I don't think that the people in this room, for example, are probably engaged in that discussion. So they haven't been taking part of the discussion about whether you want to spend that money on those kinds of services. The other thing is, when it's taken off, now this is a potential subsidy to growth. So it's not paid for through the development charge. That $560–70 million is now paid for by all property taxpayers. So what costs for what kinds of services are the property taxpayers in general picking up? What growth-related costs? Again, a lot of it is with respect to water and wastewater, so this is just by type. There's $66 million of road-related costs in that amount as well. And this just shows as well by individual types of services, the shares that are paid for by development charges versus through other means, for example, put onto the property tax. And again, I draw attention to the roads and related as something that is covered by everyone in this room. So there is a subsidy to growth then through the way things are structured here. And I guess the question is, when you're talking about subsidizing growth, what kinds of growth are you talking about? Maybe, it's okay, maybe you don't mind subsidizing certain kinds of growth. Well, this is where the growth has been over the last, well, it's not the last 5 years, from 2006 to 2013. This is just residential growth. So it shows by ward the number of residential housing starts or units in each of the different wards of the city. So that, you see, each of those sort of smallish dots is about 200 housing units. So the pattern is that most of the growth is in the outer areas of the city and some in the inner ring and a little bit less right in the center. And when you break it down by type, you'll see that, and this is not surprising, obviously, the growth that tends to be in the central areas have more apartments, that's the purple, and the growth that tends to be in the outer areas is more grade-related housing, that's singles and townhouses mostly. The blue is single detached and the orange is townhouses. Okay, so that's the first sort of thing that's going on. So it's not, you're all paying for growth. Growth does not pay for growth, 100%. So the second thing is that reurbanization, that is development in areas that have already been urbanized, subsidizes greenfields development through the development charge. And I'm going to explain hopefully very quickly how that happens. With respect to the current situation, the way development charges are structured is that you pay by the type of unit. So there's a certain charge for single detached, a lower charge for townhouses, and then a slightly, but not very, lower charge for apartments. And this is really because it's based on per person. So they figure out, you know, it costs $10,000 per person for the infrastructure, and there's 3.5 people in a single detached house on average versus 2.5 in a townhouse. And so they just multiply it. That's how they get to that. There are some area-based additions in Hamilton, as I'm sure you know, for the Binbrook area and for Dundas Water Dam that are on top of these for locally specific services. On the non-residential side, it's based on per square foot of buildable area. So there's different rates for industrial uses versus non-industrial, which would be like shops and offices and so on. And for shops and offices, it goes up. The rate goes up as the more you build. And actually, that's a kind of reverse exemption. It's actually for the first 5,000 square feet, there's a 50% exemption. For the second 5,000 square feet, there's a 75% exemption, and then there's no exemption after that. So the thing is that the subsidy is really about the fact that the location of development isn't taken into account. So if you were to build, say, a townhouse on a greenfield site in a suburban area, the charge in Hamilton is the same as whether you build a townhouse downtown in an already urban area on an existing vacant site. And the problem with this is it embeds a cross-subsidy between those two areas because the costs are not the same. So what I have here is, these are the development charges actually from the City of Kitchener. City of Kitchener does actually differentiate its development charge based on the actual costs between the older urban area, the existing urban area, and new greenfield suburban areas. So when you put an average uniform citywide charge in place, which is essentially what we have in Hamilton, it means that, you know, by definition, some areas cost less than the average and some cost more than the average. And in an urban context, it's typically the older urban areas that cost less than the average, so they're overcharged by some amount shown in the brackets. And then in the suburban areas, they're undercharged by another amount shown in the red brackets. So essentially what happens is it's built into an average cost-based development charge, this underpricing of some kinds of development and overcharging of others. And what happens is the cheaper to service stuff that is in the older urban area actually ends up subsidizing the suburban development through the development charge. So it's like you buy a smart car, and every time you buy a smart car, a certain part of that price goes to pay for somebody else's SUV, for those who like the car analogy. So it's quite easy to deal with this by having an area-based development charge. It's just what they do in Kitchener, for example. And I do believe this was an item of discussion around the time the last development charge was brought into effect here. I don't know all the details. I wasn't involved in that. But as you can see by this quote, which is something I pulled from one of the reports on that, which basically said we can't do that in Hamilton or anywhere else, I think is what they were saying, because certain kinds of costs, you can't really allocate them on a benefits basis because they're a network cost. So if you have stormwater management, that's a local thing. You can figure out like what area that benefits. But when it comes to things like automobile costs and the costs of roads, you can't do that because it's all one network. But that assumes, again, that you're using this benefits-based model for allocating the cost. Whereas you can actually use a cost causation model. That is to say, the person who causes the cost pays for the cost, which is a different approach. And if you do that, you can actually allocate those costs very easily. For example, for roads, you can use trip generation data. How many automobile trips, if you put a townhouse in a certain area, would that prompt versus if you put a townhouse in another area, it might prompt different amount of car travel and therefore a different amount of infrastructure cost. And in fact, you have that data for Hamilton. What this shows is the median auto trip length for a driver. This is for 24 hours. This is over the period of 24 hours. What is the average automobile trip length? And you can see, obviously, that varies quite a bit from area to area. Some places are under the average, which is the red bar. That's the average for Hamilton. And some places are considerably over the average. But this isn't, so this would suggest some places create more cost and some create less cost when it comes to road demand. But this is not reflected in the development charge. It's uniform. They assume the cost is the same. The only thing that varies is how many people are in your house. This is just the same data for the peak period. It's actually a little bit more extreme if you just look at the morning peak automobile trip length. And also you can see that the amount or the share of trips that are taken by car vary, of course, depending on where you are in the city. The availability of transit obviously would be a factor there, but some areas walking and cycling is also more prevalent. Okay, my third example is about the DC exemption. So some people would say, okay, but we eliminate the development charge in Hamilton in the downtown area. And I would argue that that DC exemption is actually, at least in part, a sprawl subsidy. And now we're going deep into wonk territory here. I just want to warn you, we're really getting in deep here. But the reason for that is that, again, if you look at these blue bars, these bars are the actual cost. And so some areas are overcharged the amount in the brackets. That would be, say, development in the downtown, particularly when we also know that there's been employment and population losses in this downtown, which to me suggests existing capacity to add a lot of development before you actually start incurring any cost at all. So you have this average cost. Now, you add an exemption, which is what they do here. So development in the downtown is 90% exempted. But what makes up the actual development charge in the downtown? Part of it is the cost of development. So if there's new growth to be added, any infrastructure costs that have to be paid for, that is included in that blue bar. But part of it is the overcharging, because you have an average cost-based development charge to begin with. So when you're exempting development, part of what you're exempting is the sprawl subsidy, and part of what you're exempting is the actual cost. So to me, it would make much more sense to actually just set the development charge at the actual cost in the downtown or the older urban area, which is probably going to be quite a bit lower. And part of the reason I think exemptions are required is because the price isn't set very well to begin with. It's overcharged to begin with. And again, it's not a Hamilton-specific problem. This is common across most Ontario municipalities. Okay, lastly, overcharging denser development. Okay, so these two different projects, one on the left, one on the right. Question is, what do they have in common? And I'm sure you know the answer, which is they both pay the same development charge in total. And the reason for that is, again, because they both have the same number of people in them. This is not from Hamilton. This is an example from somewhere else, to be not named. But so both of these projects, subdivision and the two apartment buildings, if they were to be constructed anew in this nameless municipality, would have to pay $6.7 million of development charges, both of them, because they both have the same number of people. In fact, the one on the left would have to pay more in education development charges because that's on a pure per unit basis, doesn't differentiate on side based on the size of the units, and there's more units. Even though they have the same number of people, there's less people, so there's more units in that one. So I guess the question is, do we think that these two types of developments incur the same kinds of costs, particularly with respect to linear infrastructure? I think probably the answer is no. Another example of that is with respect to non-residential development. So when you charge on a per square meter basis for development for an office building, that's a built-in disincentive to densification, because if you have a site, say your site is 1 hectare, the more you build, the more you have to pay. So it doesn't encourage any kind of densification. If you had a charge that was on a per hectare basis, so, you know, it was, say, $100,000 per hectare, you would be incentivized to put more development, because then you could spread that cost over more floor area. In the case of Hamilton, it's actually, because you have this sort of exemption for the development charge, it's kind of worse than usual, because most of the linear costs associated with serving a building are about the first floor. It's like bringing the roads and pipes and water to that first floor. As you go up, the costs for each additional floor actually go down. But in this case, the costs, so here's the cost going down, but the development charge goes up. So it's kind of like a worse than normal disincentive to densification. So if you want densification along the LRT, this is something that's operating against that goal. So you'll be thankful to know it's time to recap. Okay, with respect to spending then, so really important to get that balance, make sure that there's a really integrated approach between the spending on particularly roads versus the transit network, with respect to the pricing side of things, the benefits to existing development, that growth subsidies are paid by all, and that brings the DC lower. Citywide development charge rates embed a cross-subsidy between greenfields development and already urban area development to greenfields development, that the DC exemption is at least in part a subsidy to inefficient development, and that the DC rates overcharge higher density and undercharge low density, disincentivize. So what are our public sector price signals saying? Essentially, the kind of stuff that I think you would want around the LRT: denser development, multi-story development, development on already urbanized land, multi-unit buildings. This is precisely the kind of development that is being discouraged by the development charge. And on the other side of it, there are specific existing incentives for the low density development and greenfields development. Like, this is kind of built in. It's inadvertent. I don't think this is like a grand kind of scheme that somebody's concocted, but these are unintended consequences of the way that the DC has been designed. Don't other incentives make up for it? Yes, there are a good roster of incentives for development in the brownfields, in the BIAs, downtown, property tax breaks, DC tax breaks. These are good in that they are targeted at public objectives. They are deliberate, they're transparent, but they are also being, they're at odds with these other kinds of incentives that are at work, that are hidden, that are implicit, and that are inadvertent, and that is for greenfields development and for inefficient development. So those two things are at odds with each other. They're what I call dueling subsidies. They're working at cross purposes. And at the same time, while there's subsidies to both sides of this issue, of course, there's public money being spent. And so the outcome is not likely to be very efficient if those incentives are essentially canceling each other out. What to do about it? Structure the development charge correctly. There are lots of places that are doing this to great success. This is Kitchener. This is the example I mentioned already, which has 3 different areas and charges 3 different levels of charge based on the actual cost. The region of Halton introduced an area-based charge for water and wastewater. And here you can see how much it actually varies. So within the built boundary, that's how they define their areas, it's about half. The development charge is half for water and wastewater than it is compared to greenfields development. Markham is probably the most sophisticated. It's a range of different approaches, including a per hectare approach, so that idea that I mentioned about charging on a land area basis, so you're incentivizing density, not disincentivizing it. And if you were to do these things, what you find is that you get more accurate pricing. And these development charges are typically passed through. The developer doesn't just absorb the cost, he'll pass them through in, say, the final price of a house. And the way things are now, because everything gets averaged out through the average development charge, the price differences between, say, an apartment and a detached house are not as great as they should be in the market, because the DCs don't differentiate. And if you were to actually put in place a more efficient charge, a more accurate charge, those differences would become more apparent. So this is just a hypothetical exercise that I did where I recalculated, this was, you know, for fun, I recalculated a development charge from an existing regional municipality in a way that it would take land area into account. So rather than just say it's based on population, and this is for the land-related kinds of infrastructure in the blue bars. So what you'd see is that the charge for an apartment would go down by about half, and the charge for a detached house would go up a bit, and this has to do with the distribution of units. And I took the most conservative approach here. So that is the biggest apartment in the lowest building and the smallest single detached. So you could see that the actual spread between those types increases. And then if you factor in, is it on already urban area land or is it on greenfields land, that spread becomes even more pronounced. So just to say that, you know, basically we're overcharging development on already urban land and basically all apartments. So SHIFT requires an integrated approach. You know, I think we're working on the planning. There's some work on the spending. The pricing is really a part that often gets overlooked, but a really important part in terms of driving decision-making that affect urban development patterns. Really important to get all those ducks in a row. With the public investment side of things, a rigorously aligned integrated investment plan. I mean rigorously. And with respect to the pricing, also aligned with the vision, whatever that is that you have for your community, for your LRT, for the area around the LRT. And that where there are subsidies, that they be deliberate, they be transparent, and they achieve public objectives. Thank you.
We're going to get started again. All right, thank you all for coming out. Thank you all for staying, and thank you for looking after the bar and you know, supporting Mills Hardware. It's a fantastic venue, and we want to make sure that they can. Right on. We want to make sure they're thriving so they can continue to host awesome events like this. So for this part of the evening, we're hoping to have not so much of a formal Q&A, but more of a conversation. So we're hoping for a lot of participation. We want to make sure, of course, that it's positive and that it's respectful and that we're solution-oriented and that, you know, we're not using this as an opportunity to you know, to issue a manifesto and that kind of thing. We want to stay focused on the topic at hand. In addition to Dr. Blais, we have a few more distinguished panelists, and I'm really excited to introduce them. We have Steve Malloy. He's a transportation project manager. He's actually the project manager responsible for the Transportation Master Plan Review, so be gentle. Couldn't pay me enough. We have Steve Malloy, who's he's the manager of development planning with the city, and he's at the very end. I skipped Rick. Steve, what did I say? I'm sorry, we have two Steve Malloys. No, we have Steve Malloy from transportation and Steve Robichaud from planning, and we also have, this is why they bring me to do this, I'm so professional. We also have Rick Lintak, who is the founder of Lintak Architects in Hamilton. He's done a number of wonderful infill projects, particularly through the lower city, and has a wealth of experience on dealing with the city and trying to make all the numbers add up. So we're very excited to have all of the panelists here. And like I said, we're hoping to have a really positive, constructive discussion. And then we will get things wrapped up by 9 o'clock. So just to get things started, I was hoping to kind of put a question, I guess, to Pamela, but to everyone, we have a lot of already built form in Hamilton, which is very suburban, very location inefficient, I think is one of the terms that gets used. What can we do in order to re-urbanize the built form that we already have, which is costing us so much in terms of congestion and inefficiency and wasted trips and all of this? I'll just pass the mic along.
Well, I guess you're talking about outside of the LRT area at this point. So, well, the obvious answer is reurbanization. So to figure out places in those areas that have capacity, that have the potential, in terms of the development sites, if they're underutilized, and that also have the need for additional services. Again, if you're adding in new development, if you're adding in new residential units, new density, bringing people into an area, then that supports a new range of services, of shops, of amenities. So it's really a matter of finding some strategic locations where a lot of those different characteristics come together and putting in place a plan in conjunction with the community. So figuring out, okay, what is the best use or redevelopment of that area. Typically it would be at a major intersection or along a main street. The City of Toronto, we have our Avenues study, and we've done that in conjunction with streetcar in their own rights of way and putting in place a proactive planning framework that was worked out in conjunction with the neighborhood. So I live near St. Clair in Toronto. The street was changed to have a streetcar in its own right of way. And when that was put in place, there was a process with the neighborhood where we figured out, okay, what kind of development, it's just on the street, it doesn't go back, it protects the existing neighborhoods, and a proactive zoning framework was put in place that was agreed up front for the whole length of the corridor, so that when a developer came along, there wasn't a major process to go through. If it conformed with this now three-dimensional zoning envelope that included setbacks, so that the buildings behind were impacted, that essentially that project could go ahead with more or less just site plan or building permit approval. And that's been very successful. So it's finding those strategic places where there's that potential and then putting a proactive framework in place.
Would the panelists like to add anything to that? Okay. We have our answer. Let's put it in practice. Okay, I'd like to open this up. Does anybody? Okay, I've got a question from the public record.
So the downtown parking structure was brought up. I was saying Steve Robichaud, Jason Thorne, and I had an interesting discussion on this parking structure a few weeks ago, and it changed my mind because initially I was wanting to take a pitchfork to the idea of a parking structure, and he was saying his goal behind the parking structure is A, that it's going to be the first floor is going to be alive to the street. It's not parking on the first floor. But B, to try to create better parking spaces that will decrease demand on surface lots to increase the incentive for those surface lots to become useful beyond surface parking. So I'm asking Steve Robichaud how that sort of parking structure fits into the discussion here. Because my reaction was exactly that. Lock the parking structure, but Jason Thorne turned me around to seeing where the goal of staff was.
So thank you. As you may or may not know, earlier this week there was a report to Planning Committee in response to an RFI with property owners to see if there was an interest in doing a joint venture for a parking structure within the downtown. As part of the Transportation Master Plan, it really looked at coming up with a parking strategy for short-term and long-term parking within the downtown, and what are those opportunities really to accommodate the long-term parking and still meeting the short-term parking needs in more centralized locations and animating the streetscape. So you are correct, looking at having a ground floor retail or office type uses on the ground floor. And hopefully by creating those opportunities, we will start seeing more and more pressure or more interest in redeveloping the surface parking lots for commercial or residential or mixed uses going forward. The real challenge is the cost in developing those surface parking spots. They're about parking garage is about $50,000 per parking space, so it's getting the economics to work based on the current short or long-term parking rates. If you can park all day for $4.75 as an early bird special, it makes it very difficult to actually get the economic numbers to work in those parking structures. But as we can start increasing those parking rates, hopefully over time, then we might also see more interest in redeveloping some of these lots or bringing forward some of these mixed-use parking, ground floor retail, parking on the second and third floor, and then the upper floors being either office or residential type uses.
If I can comment about the architecture of parking garages. There's a lot of parking garages in Chicago. Because the soil is so bad, they can't go below. So a lot of those buildings, they have the first 3, 4, or 5 stories are actually parking, but you don't see it because of the way it's designed. If you have a big enough lot, you can actually ring residential units on the outside of a parking structure, so that parking is totally invisible. So whether a parking garage per se is the right thing or not, I'm not going to comment on, but there are ways that it can be dealt with architecturally.
And I guess my only point is just to validate what Steve was saying is the parking pricing is in terms of policy and how we move forward, and if we're going to provide incentives and disincentives for alternative modes of transportation, having cheap parking doesn't support people thinking about taking different ways. And really the way I think about it, especially from a monthly parking perspective, is our pricing, is that equal to a monthly transit pass? And if we keep to have policies that are equalizing different modes of transportation, then we have difficulties trying to make people make a choice and have better options to move around the city.
That is excellent. I would just add one other thing, which is, again, looking for a pricing solution rather than an engineering solution, and that would be, I don't know if Hamilton does this, but in many municipalities, property taxes are reduced or exempted for vacant lots, and that just encourages people to keep them vacant for a longer period of time. So that might be something to look at, and also taxing parking revenue is the other thing which is being looked at in a lot of cities.
One of the questions I have is, and you sort of alluded to this in looking at how some municipalities have development charge areas. How much power do cities actually have under provincial law in order to put these kinds of property tax and development charge, the sort of the more targeted approach? How much, I know like with development charges, we actually are required to give a discount by the province, and for vacant properties, under the Municipal Act, we're actually required to give a property tax discount. So where are the opportunities where we actually can do that and the province will let us do it?
With respect to the development charges, there's actually a lot of flexibility. I gave some different examples. The town, well, now the city of Markham has a very sophisticated approach, and they do their development charges based on planning area. This is what they do out west as well in a lot of western cities, in Regina, Calgary, Edmonton. It's all based on the different planning areas. And in those areas as well, they particularly out west, it's almost always just per hectare. It's not based on the unit type or anything like that. It's just how much land is being developed. So that really provides that incentive for densification. But there's really, there's not really that many restrictions. I think there's actually quite a bit of room for creativity in structuring a kind of, more customized development charge. There's not really a lot of restrictions in the Act from that point of view, from an area basis, or even, again, if you want to charge on a per land area basis, that would be allowed as well. There's places that do it, obviously, and they have been, like the city of Markham's been doing that for 15 years, I would say. So there's also new, just reminded me, there's the new Development Charges Act is coming into to play. Well, they made some amendments that is just going to be adopted. I think they just had third reading, actually. And that is actually more explicitly allowing area-based charges. So before it was always allowed, but now it is actually going to be more explicitly authorized.
And I believe one of the things that they're adding is they're actually going to add the cost of transit, as it will be required to be paid out of development charges under the change to the Act. I believe. I could be wrong, but I mean, I'm not a planner. Yes, we have a question from the front.
Can you understand why some cities and municipalities have been better at this? Like you mentioned Kitchener and Markham. And now, are they particularly politically different than other places? What motivates a city to have a better approach than cities?
The question was, what motivates some places to do better development charges than others? It's a great question. I don't really know the answer. I think for those cases, there's different answers. In the case of Markham, I think that was entirely personal. The city manager at the time really understood this issue perfectly well, and he basically instructed the staff, this is how we're going to be structuring our development charges, and it's going to be more cost related, and that's how it happened there. With respect to Kitchener, I think it's a combination of wanting to change development patterns and realizing that this is a factor, and a price factor that will actually have an impact in shaping development patterns. And I think there's also there is a municipal finance component too, because those low density sprawl development patterns are expensive to service. I mean, we have the numbers on that. And I think municipalities more and more are realizing that that is a very expensive way to grow their cities. And in the long term, it's not financially sustainable. So they're looking for other ways that are more financially sustainable.
Oh, perfect. I was actually going to ask you.
What I would like to add is, as part of the last development charges update and the review, we did get a direction from council to look at what a differential DC rate would mean for the city of Hamilton. So it's an ongoing exercise working between public works, growth management, and planning. We've been focusing primarily on the downtown, looking at growth forecasts, growth allocation, then the infrastructure to support that growth, and then work with our finance department to come back and say, what would that mean in terms of a DC? So it's a fairly large undertaking and a project to do, but it's something that we're currently involved in. So we're still right now at the area we're looking at, which sites within the downtown will redevelop, what would be the density, and then translating that in through our water and wastewater models and the other infrastructure models to come back and say, okay, from a DC perspective, what would this mean from the city of Hamilton? And then to have that public policy debate to say that if we wanted to move to this model, what would it look like? I mean, I think what you were indicating is if you add another unit or add more people, you always have to upgrade your water and wastewater treatment plant. There's some costs are fixed. The other issue we have to look at are changing service levels or changing infrastructure requirements. The pipes were installed under a certain set of assumptions. As the Ministry of the Environment or those other assumptions change, do we still have capacity or don't we have capacity within that network? And if we then need to start upgrading the infrastructure to accommodate that additional growth, then who would pay for that and how does that play out? So it's a very complicated discussion to look at. It's not always that easy to assume that there is capacity within the infrastructure, within the established urban area as of right. We are finding out that there are circumstances where there isn't capacity, either because the service levels have changed or the requirements have changed or other factors have come into play. So this is one of the things that we are now playing around with to see what that'll be, and hopefully we'll be reporting back sometime in 2016 to council as to the results of those investigations.
Thank you. Oh, yes, question from here.
The development charges only change in 4 years from now, 2019. I thought that we were looking at it again in 2019, and then the council will vote on it then? Or are we allowed to change it in between?
Anytime. So if council wanted the development charges passed, and then that's good for a certain period of time. At the end of that time period, you do a mandatory review of your development charges bylaw. However, if circumstances do change, or if council felt there was a reason to take a look at either changing one or more elements of the DC bylaw, there is nothing that would preclude council from doing it. It's just that there are mandatory periods at which council must update the development charges bylaw. And if they don't, then effectively your bylaw expires, and it's usually done on a 5-year cycle. One of the things that happens is even though after you've done the work, you pass the bylaw, there's a lot of challenges to the bylaw. So by the time you sort of work your way through all of those challenges, you're almost into that cycle of starting the bylaw review again. So it's almost always happening in terms of a development charges bylaw update. And then in Hamilton's case, or with the Bill 73, with second reading as it comes into law, then it may change as to those sort of things that we can and cannot charge for and how you calculate your service levels. So there may be a requirement at that point in time, working with depending on what the finance department suggests, whether or not we should review the development charges bylaw sooner than later. We will wait and see sort of where Bill 73, ultimately what comes out of those discussions at the provincial level. As you can imagine, as much as there are people to push in one direction on the DC bylaw, there's people, interest groups pushing the other way, right? And that's why we have the 85%, the 15% mandatory discount. That was brought in under the hope that it would create more affordable housing. Whether it did or did not, that's still up for debate, but that's part of the things. So it really isn't 100% full cost recovery. There's those mandatory discounts that are by law built into it, and that was in response, I think, primarily from the development industry that said, no, you shouldn't be full charging because of the affordable housing component, right? One of the other big changes in Halton Region is they use the Municipal Act to bridge that gap. The province, through the DC Bill 73, was looking at getting rid of those Section 110 agreements, which so therefore then, in Halton Region, they're in for a bit of a surprise when now suddenly those mandatory discounts are going to be paid for through the taxpayer as through the development community. So those are sorts of the things that are at play. The other thing, too, that's sort of missing from this debate and discussion is parkland dedication. Development industry would really like to see parkland dedication rates being ratcheted down. We just recently did an 18-month reduced rate for intensification projects through our DC bylaw while we're updating it. We were having this situation where certain projects in the downtown were paying more on a per unit basis than a single family dwelling in a suburban location. So as a result of that review, council agreed to lower the DC rates for apartments to a maximum of $7,500 a unit, where some of our mid to high rise apartments, they were paying $12,500 a unit. So that was one of the other factors that we've taken a look at. We've also said that for certain intensification projects, there will be a cap on the parkland dedication rate, and in other cases, there won't be any parkland dedication. So in cases of heritage buildings, if you're restoring a heritage building and you're adding more units, we lowered the parkland dedication rate in that case, or people are adding accessory apartments within single-family dwellings. They were paying $3,500 per unit when they were doing a basement apartment or an accessory apartment in a house. We brought that down to under $1,000 as a way to encourage additional dwelling units to be created through small-scale intensification and or the reuse of heritage buildings.
Oh. Yes, question from here.
So just to follow up on the parkland dedication, in the draft we would like to understand that the parkland dedication was not only high, but it had to be spent on new parkland, of which you can't develop in an existing urban core. Is that correct?
That's the way the Planning Act is structured. It's more for park acquisition, parkland acquisition, as opposed to the renewal of existing parks.
So that's another direct subsidy of development in the downtown core for greenfield development. We're paying for new parkland in the greenfield.
At the time of issuance of a building permit, the developer will make parkland dedication payment. All of that money within the City of Hamilton goes into a centralized account, and then it's allocated through the capital budget process as council prioritizes which parks are developed when, as they come on stream. In other cases, though, sometimes that money can be used for the acquisition. Say if a school is declared surplus and sold, the city may use that money to actually acquire the school site in order to maintain some green space within the neighborhood. So it's used throughout the city based on sort of what council sets as the priorities going forward.
Let's get a question from a little bit farther back. It's one right at the very back there.
Hi, Rich Joller. I've come here from a very strange place. It's called Dundas. Kind of an amalgam of what we're talking about in terms of sprawl and sort of intense urban existing development. We're currently in a bit of a fight in Dundas over a very small postage stamp piece of land that a kind developer has come and wants to build some residential units on to the tune of about 9 stories. And there's been a lot of pushback within the community. They want that reduced to something in the neighborhood of maybe 5 to 6 stories. So my question for the panel is there any such thing as too much intensification?
I guess we'll start with Pamela.
Yes, absolutely there is. I mean, from many different points of view, but certainly from a context point of view, from a pure planning point of view, it's not always the best answer to put as much development on a particular site as possible. So I think, you have to look at what is the context and is a particular project. I mean, I'm not talking about your particular project, but in general, you know, what is the relationship of that project to the surrounding area, and does it make sense from a purely physical building point of view, as well as from other perspectives. You know, what is the pressure that project puts on other development in the area? What are the pressures on services and so on? So I think, yes, there is definitely a sense where there's too much development. And the City of Toronto, I think we're kind of getting to that point now. Downtown, there's been so much development there that they're now actually starting a new exercise to look at, you know, just can we actually service this growth? What kind of a place do we want that to be? And it's kind of the same questions, but on a different scale.
Well, that's not my project, so. But I do agree that there can be such a thing as too much development. I think it makes sense to optimize as much as possible. We have to take into account the existing context, the existing neighborhood, where we are required to do quite often urban design briefs, where we have to basically justify our designs and indicate how they comply with the city site plan guidelines and good design principles. Part of that is sun shadow, the impacts on existing neighborhoods. So there is a balance in terms of how much is too much.
I think what's really important is there's a very simple mantra that density without good design equals disaster, and that's one of the very important considerations. What is the overall design in that building, and how does it fit into the surrounding context? Because you can have two buildings, the exact same density as you measure it in terms of units per hectare or persons per hectare, but it really comes down to the design of the building, and is it sympathetic to the context in which that building is located. Good planning doesn't equal good architecture, and good architecture doesn't always equal good planning, but the role is for both architecture and planning to work together, sort of to take advantage and sort of the synergies between those, and hopefully have a very successful product at the end of the day. That's a very important consideration when we're dealing with it. So we often look at it's not just density for the sake of density, and you can have something sort of over intensification or sort of intensification sprawl. So you really want to look at where you're having your intensification and how we're using that also in Hamilton's context to leverage it to other public benefits and other public goods that we're trying to maximize when we're directing intensification to certain areas within the city, whether those be within the nodes or along our corridors or in other areas where we want to encourage intensification. And there are other areas of the city that are stable residential neighborhoods, and we're more to discourage intensification in those locations.
Actually, just to follow up on that a little bit, I want to put the other Steve on the hot seat for just a minute. I hope you'll forgive me. But one of the issues in Dundas is that Hamilton actually does area rate some things, not development charges, but we do area rate transit funding. And in Dundas, through an agreement that predates the amalgamation in 2001, Dundas ratepayers pay a lower rate towards transit and receive a lower level of transit service in response. So one of the issues with this building in Dundas is that the transit service is actually not good enough that it would support a lot of people not owning a car. So I was wondering, like, what can we do? Now, I'm not going to ask you to comment on area rating. I wouldn't do that to you. But generally speaking, I'd like you to just discuss a little bit the role of transit investment in actually shifting movement patterns away from driving and reducing the need to provide all of the infrastructure that driving requires.
Well, just from a logical perspective, if you invest in other modes of transportation, you will have an uplift of that shift. Each location is going to have different things that would affect that. So, but I think just from a basic principles point of view, if you increase transit service levels through an increase in investment, then there will be a benefit to the local community, but over the overall community. I'll bring it back to LRT because as I'm doing our engagement throughout the entire city, some people in Binbrook or Waterdown will say, well, the LRT doesn't affect me. But as we know, even if they do travel to the lower city, the people who are servicing the shops that they're attending or going to the games that they're attending, take transit to provide those services to them. So it's not a direct, probably, impact on them, but it is an indirect impact on their lives. So I just want to bring it back to that investment, back to the LRT, in providing that kind of investment can affect other parts of the city as well. So it's not just maybe a localized issue, but it's a citywide issue as well.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. And you were giving me do you have a question? Oh, okay. Okay, great. Okay, so one more question from the back.
I have always been confused by development charges, and I will probably forever remain confused out of development charges. And I wanted to go to Mr. Robichaud. I found your answer to be really complex, and I guess I'm looking for some assurance that in the city's reconsideration of the development charges, you're going to be driven by a vision of what we hope LRT will provide for our community, including an economic uplift. And I guess I'm looking for some feedback from you on has that or will that discussion take place in consideration of our DC policy being driven by a vision on what we're trying to achieve with LRT.
Maybe the way we look at terms of dealing with the city's growth management strategy. Based on the provincial growth forecasts, which actually drive right down, that municipalities have to plan based on the provincial growth forecasts under places to grow. Those forecasts are not only in terms of absolute population, but they get into unit types. How many single, semis, rows, and apartments are being sort of allocated in terms of the growth for the city of Hamilton. What we want to look at then is to take those growth forecasts, especially where they provide those opportunities for intensification and redevelopment, and allocate them to those areas that will maximize the public benefit and support those other objectives and goals that the city has. So that's why when we did the growth management strategy, it was based on a nodes and corridor strategy, and then put in place either the zoning and the infrastructure that supports those nodes and corridors, and then also through this other reviews, looking at those other policy tools that we can also use to help facilitate that intensification and redevelopment opportunities. So historically what the city has used is a series of community improvement plans where we waive or reduce DCs or building permit fees or other charges in order to encourage intensification and redevelopment to occur in certain areas. What we're saying is, as part of the downtown DC review, is we're just sort of looking at it from a different lens, but the goal is always the same, of encouraging redevelopment and economic revitalization in some areas that can benefit from those incentives, and in other areas where they don't need those incentives, don't provide those incentives, so that we're targeting growth to those areas where we want to target growth in terms of a balanced growth strategy. So that's what the analysis right now, we're attempting to answer those questions. So the first thing is we wanted to look at what are the growth opportunities within the downtown, realistically in terms of where do we think growth will occur, what is the infrastructure required to support that growth, cost out what those infrastructure requirements are, determine as per the DC bylaw who are the benefiting property owners versus who are the growth related component of that, and then figure out what would be the appropriate DC in that charge under that scenario. So we're still very early in this process, but that's sort of the ultimate end goal where we want to be able to answer those questions is, can we have a differential DC rate in the city of Hamilton that would encourage redevelopment intensification in certain areas so that really they're paying their appropriate share or their appropriate DC charge. We don't know the answer to that yet because we haven't worked our way through those calculations yet.
I would just add one little thing to that, which is with the advent of the LRT, it may be useful to do that analysis for the LRT corridor rather than just the downtown.
Yeah.
Okay.
Target area, the direction was the downtown. So maybe, I mean, The LRT announcement came quickly, and now we're planning to, I mean, we've always sort of planning for it, but we're sort of making some adjustments to our work programs. The first thing that council agreed to was in August of this year, we outlined how to make LRT happen, including the creation of an LRT office. Last month, council passed an interim control bylaw along the LRT corridor. That'll give us a year to update the zoning, and then that zoning information, which will also then translate sort of into built form, like what can we anticipate seeing along the corridor, will then feed into an infrastructure assessment, and then that will then feed into the sort of DCs or other tools or other incentives that we need to sort of investigate. So we're putting together a complete package along the LRT corridor. It's a very compressed time frame, and we have a lot of work to do, but we're sort of laying out those stages moving forward to deal with the LRT issue.
And there has been quite a bit of design work done already in terms of urban form to make sure that the proper amount of intensity occurs without, again, affecting the existing stable neighborhoods behind, issues of sun shadow and that sort of thing. So quite a lot of work was done a few years ago, back when we were all excited about it. And then that kind of like fizzled away. And but a lot of groundwork has already been done.
Okay, thank you. Well, that gets us just past 9 o'clock. Is Kyle Sloat still here? I think, no, okay, he had to leave. So I just wanted to, on behalf of the Useful Knowledge Society of Hamilton, I wanted to first of all thank Mills Hardware for providing this amazing space. It's fantastic. I wanted to thank Joey Coleman from the Public Record for recording this. He's going to be posting the video sometime soon. I also want to thank Richard Allen from Renew Hamilton, who recorded the audio, and I think he'll be posting that as well. And there's an amazing wealth of meetings there that he's recorded over the years. And there's a lot of great stuff. I want to thank our panelists, Steve Robichaud, Rick Lintak, and Steve Malloy, particularly for Steve and Steve coming from working at the city. It took a lot of courage for them to come up here, and I really appreciate them being there. And Rick, I have to say, his buildings are particularly good at fitting into the existing urban context and really playing nicely with their neighbors. So he's a great person to talk to about this stuff. And finally, of course, we have to thank Pamela Blais. I'm really impressed, not only with just the level of insight in the presentation in general, but the very specific Hamilton information. She's obviously done a lot of work to bring the numbers home and talk about what we're doing here. And this has been an incredible resource. I really hope the city uses this as they review their DC policy, because this tells us how to move forward and to make sure we're actually charging what these things cost so that we can bring price in line with what we want to see. So thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Okay, thank you. Have a great evening.